How I Completely Destroyed a Narcissist Monster with Their Own Reflection, a Psychological Audiobook. Chapter 1. The Moment I Realized I Wasn't Dealing with a Person. There is a moment, quiet, subtle, almost unremarkable, when you realize you are no longer dealing with a human being operating in good faith. Nothing dramatic happens. No explosion, no confession, no mask violently ripped off. Just a pattern that repeats one too many times, a contradiction that doesn't resolve, a reaction that doesn't match reality, a response that feels rehearsed instead of present. That's when it hit me. This wasn't conflict. This wasn't misunderstanding. This wasn't even malice in the ordinary sense. This was a system, a closed loop of manipulation, entitlement, and control, running on instinct, not conscience. A machine that feeds on attention, compliance, reaction, and emotional energy. A thing that does not grow, does not learn, and does not self-reflect. A narcissist doesn't evolve. It recycles. The same tactics, the same stories, the same emotional scripts, just new targets. At first, I did what most intelligent, rational people do. I assumed reason would work. That clarity would resolve things. That if I explained myself well enough, honestly enough, calmly enough, understanding would follow. That assumption nearly cost me everything. Because narcissists don't interpret explanation as clarity. They interpret it as supply. Every word you offer becomes data. Every justification becomes leverage. Every attempt to be understood becomes an opening. And the more intelligent you are, the more dangerous that becomes. Because you assume intelligence on the other side. That assumption is the trap. A narcissist does not want to understand you. They want to position themselves above you. Once I understood that, the game changed. I stopped trying to be heard, and I started observing. What I saw was not a villain in the movie sense. It was something colder, more mechanical. A creature that could not tolerate equality, that could not coexist without dominance. That required hierarchy the way other people require oxygen. And the most important realization of all, this thing could not survive reflection. Chapter 2. Why Narcissists Can't Survive Their Own Mirror. Most people think narcissists are powerful because they are aggressive. That's wrong. They are powerful because no one mirrors them back. They live their entire lives projecting outward, blame, superiority, victimhood, entitlement, without ever being forced to confront the source. They accuse, they distort, they rewrite history, and because decent people don't behave that way, the narcissist assumes immunity. That's where they make their fatal error. A narcissist does not collapse when you fight them. They collapse when you reflect them, because reflection removes illusion. When you mirror their tactics without emotion, without rage, without pleading, without fear, you do something terrifying to them. You remove uniqueness. They no longer feel special. They no longer feel superior. They no longer feel in control of the narrative. They see themselves. And narcissists cannot tolerate self-recognition. Here's what most people don't understand. The narcissist's entire identity is built on asymmetry. They speak. You react. They provoke. You defend. They distort. You explain. This imbalance keeps them powerful. The moment you mirror instead of react, the system breaks. I didn't confront the narcissist. I didn't expose them publicly. I didn't beg. I didn't rage. I simply returned their behavior, precisely, calmly, and without apology. Their tactics reflected back with awareness. Their manipulation mirrored without emotional investment. Their coldness met with colder discipline. And something extraordinary happened. They didn't become angry at first. They became confused. Confusion is the beginning of collapse. Because confusion means loss of control. They could no longer predict my reactions, could no longer script the conversation, could no longer position themselves as superior. Every move they made came back to them, clean, sharp, undeniable. They accused me of what they were doing. I calmly described the behavior, without naming them. They attempted emotional leverage. I responded with neutrality. They escalated. I slowed down. They demanded engagement. I withdrew attention, and slowly, inevitably, the mask cracked. The narcissist began contradicting themselves, escalating without cause, exposing desperation. They didn't realize it yet, but the monster was already turning inward. Because reflection is not an attack. It's a mirror, and monsters do not survive mirrors. Chapter 3. The rule I broke that ended the game. There is one rule society teaches that quietly protects narcissists more than anything else. Don't stoop to their level. It sounds moral. It sounds mature. It sounds civilized. And it's completely wrong when you're dealing with a narcissistic monster. Because narcissism is not a disagreement of values. It's not a communication problem. It's not a misunderstanding that clarity fixes. It's a predatory structure. Predators do not stop because you behave well. They stop when the environment no longer rewards the behavior. The moment I broke that rule, not by becoming reckless, but by becoming symmetrical, everything changed. Let me be precise. I did not become abusive. I did not lose control. I did not rage or threaten or explode. I became unavailable to manipulation. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped justifying boundaries. I stopped reacting emotionally to provocation. Instead, I returned energy with accuracy. Short answers, neutral tone, no over-disclosure, no reassurance, no chasing. When they twisted words, I didn't correct them. I let the distortion sit in the room. When they accused, I didn't defend. I acknowledged receipt and moved on. When they escalated emotionally, I slowed down cognitively. That's the part no one teaches you. Narcissists escalate emotion to regain dominance. When you refuse to rise with them, they fall alone. They want friction. They want heat. They want reaction. I gave them silence with structure, and that silence was louder than any argument. For the first time, they couldn't locate themselves as superior or victim. They were suspended, and suspension is intolerable to a narcissist, because without hierarchy, they don't know who they are. Chapter 4. The moment the monster turned on itself. People imagine destruction as a single event, a confrontation, a reveal, a dramatic ending. That's not how narcissistic collapse works. It's quieter, slower, more devastating. Collapse begins the moment the narcissist realizes their tactics no longer work, but cannot admit it. That's when they start making mistakes. They repeat themselves. They contradict earlier narratives. They escalate too quickly or retreat too suddenly. They begin testing boundaries aggressively, hoping you'll snap back into the old role. I didn't. I stayed still. That stillness forced the monster inward. Because when projection fails, narcissists have only two options. 1. Accept responsibility, which they cannot do, or 2. Turn the aggression inward and outward at the same time. This is where the self-destruction starts. They begin accusing you of things that make no sense. They overplay their hand. They reveal desperation. They reach for control through chaos. And here's the critical part most people miss. I didn't expose them. I let them expose themselves. I didn't chase closure. I didn't seek justice. I didn't try to win publicly. I won structurally. Every time they lashed out, I documented. Not emotionally, but strategically. Every time they lied, I stayed consistent. Every time they tried to provoke, I disengaged just enough to make the absence painful. They began unraveling without me touching them, because narcissists rely on opposition to stabilize their identity. Remove opposition, and the system eats itself. The monster didn't lose because I attacked it. It lost because it could no longer feed. And starvation is fatal to predators. Chapter 3. The rule I broke that society lies about. There is a rule society drills into people who are being abused, manipulated, drained, and psychologically eaten alive. Don't stoop to their level. It sounds noble. It sounds evolved. It sounds like the advice of people who have never faced a predator wearing a human face. That rule exists to preserve social order, not to protect you. Because narcissistic monsters do not operate by shared ethics, they operate by asymmetry. They exploit kindness, patience, forgiveness, and restraint. Every time you take the high road, they learn one thing: you will not stop them. I followed that rule at first. I stayed calm, I explained myself. I tried to reason. I believed clarity would fix distortion. I believed boundaries would be respected once understood. That belief nearly destroyed me. Here is the truth most people refuse to say out loud. A narcissist does not hear explanations. They hear weakness or threat, nothing in between. The moment I realized this, the game ended. But not the way people imagine. I didn't become cruel. I didn't rage. I didn't attack. I became symmetrical. I stopped offering emotional access without cost. I stopped answering questions designed to extract reactions. I stopped clarifying distortions that benefited them. Instead of defending my reality, I let them sit alone with theirs. When they accused, I didn't rush to correct. When they twisted words, I didn't chase understanding. When they demanded reassurance, I withheld it, not out of spite, but because reassurance is food. Narcissists survive by pulling emotional energy from others. Calm explanations, emotional appeals, attempts at fairness, all of it feeds them. So I broke the rule. I stopped being nice in ways that harmed me. I stopped being understanding when understanding was used against me. I stopped giving access to my emotional nervous system. I became controlled, deliberate, precise, and that's when the monster started panicking. Because narcissists don't fear anger, they fear irrelevance. When your emotions no longer move on their command, they lose control of the board. That's when they start escalating. Chapter 4. When the monster saw itself and couldn't escape. Most people think narcissists collapse when they are exposed. They're wrong. Narcissists collapse when mirroring replaces projection. Projection is how they survive. They dump shame, guilt, insecurity, and inadequacy into other people so they never have to hold it themselves. When projection fails, the monster has nowhere to put the poison. That's when it turns inward. The shift was subtle at first. They repeated themselves more often. They contradicted earlier narratives without realizing it. They escalated conflicts that didn't require escalation. They were trying to provoke something. Anger, sadness, explanation, reaction. I gave them none. I stayed boring. I stayed calm. I stayed consistent. And consistency is lethal to a narcissist, because consistency forces them to confront the truth they spend their entire lives avoiding. They are not in control. They began accusing me of things that didn't logically connect. They overplayed emotional reactions. They created chaos where none existed. This wasn't strength. It was panic. Here's the part that matters. I did not expose them. I did not confront them. I did not call them out. I let them self-destruct. Every message they sent became more erratic. Every attempt to dominate became more obvious. Every manipulation attempt lost subtlety. And I documented everything, not emotionally, but structurally. Patterns don't lie. Timelines don't lie. Consistency always wins against distortion. They didn't realize they were standing in front of a mirror. They thought they were still acting on me. They weren't. They were acting on themselves. The monster was now feeding on its own reflection, and it hated what it saw. This is the moment narcissists cannot survive psychologically, because they cannot integrate shame. They cannot accept fault. They cannot self-correct. So they implode. They lash out at anyone nearby. They burn bridges they need. They expose tactics they once hid. And the cruel irony? They believe they are still winning, right up until the structure collapses beneath them. I didn't destroy the monster with force. I destroyed it by removing myself as a target and letting it eat itself alive. Chapter 5. The silence that unnerved the monster. The most dangerous moment for a narcissist is not confrontation. It's not exposure. It's not being yelled at, threatened, or challenged. It's silence. Not the wounded silence of someone who's afraid. Not the sulking silence of someone who's lost. But intentional silence. The kind that says, "You are no longer the center of my decision-making." When I stopped responding the way they expected, something broke. They would send long messages designed to provoke guilt. I responded with a sentence, sometimes two, sometimes none. They would escalate tone. I kept mine level. They would introduce urgency. I removed it. This wasn't accidental. It was calculated restraint. Narcissists interpret silence as abandonment, disrespect, or defiance, all at once. They cannot tolerate ambiguity because ambiguity removes their leverage. They need to know. Are you scared? Are you angry? Are you still invested? Silence answers none of those questions, and unanswered questions rot them from the inside. The monster began filling in the gaps with its own insecurities. It imagined motives. It created threats that weren't there. The quieter I became, the louder their internal chaos grew. This is where people make the mistake of thinking silence is passive. It isn't. Silence is denial of supply, and denial is starvation. Chapter 6. How Mirroring Became the Weapon. Eventually, silence alone wasn't enough. Not because it failed, but because the narcissist escalated. They pushed harder. They crossed lines they hadn't crossed before. They tried to force a reaction. That's when mirroring became necessary. Mirroring is not imitation. It's not mockery. It's not revenge. Mirroring is precision reflection. When they distorted facts, I repeated their words back calmly. When they reframed events, I asked them to clarify, without accusation. When they projected motives, I let the projections stand in the open. I didn't add emotion. I didn't add commentary. I let them hear themselves. Narcissists are not prepared to face their own logic. They expect resistance or submission, not reflection. Each time I mirrored, they grew more agitated. They accused me of being cold. They accused me of changing. They accused me of manipulation. Those accusations were confessions, because what they were experiencing was what they had done to others, uninterrupted, unsoftened, undeniable. This is where the monster began unraveling, not because I attacked it, but because it could no longer hide. Reflection stripped away the fantasy. Silence removed the audience. And without an audience, the monster doesn't perform. It panics, and panic leads to mistakes. Chapter 7. The Panic Behind the Mask. By this point, the monster knew something was wrong. Not consciously, not verbally, but instinctively. The tactics that once worked stopped producing results. The emotional buttons no longer triggered reactions. The chaos no longer pulled me into orbit. That's when the mask started slipping. Narcissists rely on consistency from others, not from themselves. When you change the pattern, they destabilize. They began cycling emotions faster. Charm, rage, victimhood, superiority, threats, apologies. Sometimes all within the same day. This wasn't complexity, it was loss of control. They were trying to locate the version of me they used to dominate. And it wasn't there anymore. That absence terrified them, because narcissists don't regulate themselves internally. They regulate through others. When I stopped acting as their stabilizer, their internal system started malfunctioning. They over-communicated. They contradicted themselves. They exposed insecurity where there once was arrogance. The monster wasn't strong anymore. It was frantic, and frantic predators make reckless decisions. Chapter 8. The Retreat That Looked Like Attack. When narcissists lose ground, they don't retreat quietly. They disguise retreat as aggression. They lash out publicly. They smear privately. They rewrite history to preserve ego. This is the phase where many people get pulled back in because it feels like escalation means relevance. It doesn't. It means collapse. I didn't respond to the smears. I didn't defend my reputation. I didn't chase truth into chaos. I stayed still. Because smears require engagement to survive. Without resistance, lies rot. The monster burned bridges it needed. It exposed motivations it had hidden. It attacked allies instead of enemies. And here's the part narcissists never understand. Every attack was evidence. Every escalation was confirmation. I didn't need to prove anything. Time was doing the work for me. The monster wasn't advancing. It was bleeding out. And it didn't even know it yet. Chapter 9. When the story stopped working. Every narcissist survives on a story where they are misunderstood, a story where they are superior, a story where someone else is always the problem. That story is their oxygen. By the time I reached this stage, the story had stopped working, not because I challenged it, but because it no longer explained reality. Their version of events kept changing. Their justifications contradicted their actions. Their accusations no longer matched outcomes. People around them noticed. Not because I warned them, not because I exposed anything, but because the monster could no longer maintain coherence. Inconsistency is the narcissist's quiet undoing. They need others to constantly recalibrate reality to keep the illusion alive. When that stops happening, confusion spreads. I stayed consistent. My behavior didn't change. My boundaries didn't move. The contrast became undeniable. The monster tried to rewrite history faster, but speed made the cracks visible. At this point, they weren't controlling the narrative anymore. They were reacting to it, and reaction is weakness to someone who believes they are above consequence. Chapter 10. The Final Misread. This is the moment narcissists always get wrong. They assume silence means defeat. They assume distance means fear. They assume restraint means they're still winning. So they make one last move, usually a dramatic one, a public accusation, a scorched earth message, a final attempt to provoke emotion. They believe this will force engagement. It doesn't. It exposes intent. When the monster made its last move, it overreached. Too many contradictions. Too much emotion. Too much desperation. The illusion collapsed under its own weight. People didn't need convincing anymore. They could see it. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I didn't respond. Because victory over a narcissist isn't loud. It's permanent. They were left alone with the thing they feared most, themselves. And that's a prison with no escape. Chapter 11. What happens to the monster after the loss? People think the end is the confrontation. It isn't. The real end is what happens after the narcissist loses control and no longer has access to you. This is the phase no one warns you about. The monster does not heal. It does not learn. It does not grow. It retreats. And retreat doesn't mean peace. It means obsession. The narcissist replays the loss endlessly, trying to understand how dominance slipped away. They rewrite the story again and again, but none of the versions satisfy them. Because one truth keeps surfacing. They didn't lose because you were cruel. They didn't lose because you attacked. They lost because you stopped participating. That realization corrodes them. They stalk from a distance. They monitor outcomes. They measure your progress against their stagnation. Every step you take forward becomes proof of their failure. And that failure is unbearable. So they attempt one last illusion, convincing themselves they let you go, that they were above it all, that they didn't care. But narcissists always care. They care because control was their identity. And without control, there is nothing left to anchor them. The monster doesn't disappear. It decays. Chapter 12. Why I won without ever touching them again. This is the part people misunderstand the most. Winning wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about humiliation. It wasn't even about justice. It was about freedom. I didn't defeat the narcissist by destroying them directly. I defeated them by becoming unreachable. I no longer reacted. I no longer defended. I no longer explained myself. I built a life where their presence was irrelevant. And irrelevance is the one outcome narcissists cannot survive psychologically. They need to be remembered. They need to be felt. They need to be significant. even if it's negative. By moving on without acknowledgement, I removed myself as a mirror, and without a mirror, the monster has no reflection to distort. It is trapped with its own emptiness. That is not cruelty. That is consequence. I didn't destroy the monster by force. I destroyed it by letting it face exactly who it was, without interference, without supply, without escape, and I walked away intact.